The mystery hanging over the Alps began to unfold in 2021 when a skier disappeared in the snow-covered mountains. The story of this man's disappearance, seemingly just another victim of an accident on the region's icy trails, would soon evolve into something far more complex and intriguing. The skier, a man passionate about the sport, nature, and the extreme challenges the mountains provided, set out on an expedition with a clear goal: to conquer a remote peak, an area known only to those who truly understood the risks of exploring the Alps in their harshest conditions. The skier's initial motivation was simple. He lived for the biting cold of the snow, to push his limits, and to explore the unknown. His love for the mountains brought him back to the heart of the Alps time and time again, always seeking that next challenge. His friends, family, and acquaintances knew this about him, and the idea that he might be facing the most dangerous elements of the mountains seemed almost natural. But on this particular expedition, something went wrong. Unlike other times, he didn't return. He left no clear clues as to where he might be, just some scattered tracks that didn't explain what had truly happened. His disappearance was a void, an enigma that couldn't be explained by a simple human error or a natural tragedy like a skiing accident. The silence that followed his disappearance was heavy, and the concern grew as the days passed with no explanation. The case grew even more complicated because it involved a remote area where the rugged terrain and sudden storms were common, making any rescue attempt nearly impossible. The extreme conditions of the mountain climate, with snowstorms that can appear out of nowhere and strong winds that obstruct visibility and navigation, made any sort of investigation or search that much harder. But what the family didn't know at the time was that, while the skier had been swallowed by the mountains, his disappearance wasn't as simple as it seemed. Something else was happening there. Something deep within that vast white expanse, where each snowflake seemed to hide a clue. The mountains, imposing and majestic, held the secrets of a disappearance that only time could explain. The first days of the search were intense, with helicopters flying over the most remote areas and rescue teams trying to locate any sign of the skier. But the further the search progressed, the more it became clear that the case wasn't as straightforward as it appeared. The disappearance seemed to have been carefully concealed by the mountains, which, by their very nature, could hide even the most obvious traces. Nothing seemed to make sense. The only clues were fragmented and inconclusive. Witnesses claimed to have seen the skier at a certain point, but none of these statements had enough solid evidence to guide the search with confidence. For a moment, the investigators began to wonder if the skier had been the victim of something more than a natural accident. Possibilities started to arise. Had he gotten lost? Or was something more sinister at play? Could he have suffered an accident due to the weather? Or was he facing something intentional, something more malicious? The mystery deepened, fueled by the lack of clear answers and the uncertainty surrounding the entire case. Early speculations came quickly. Some suggested that the skier might have gotten lost due to reduced visibility from the snowstorms. Others said that the sudden and hostile weather might have caused an accident, leading the skier to fall into a crevasse or an inaccessible area. But there were also those who began to propose darker theories, suggesting that the disappearance could have been the result of a personal tragedy, perhaps even something intentional, like suicide. However, none of these theories were confirmed, and what began as a search for a missing skier soon turned into a case where mystery and suspense replaced answers. The most obvious, yet terrifying question was, what if the skier was somewhere out there, still alive, battling the relentless forces of nature and the ticking clock? As time went on and the search became more exhausting, the case grew even more tangled. Suspicions increased. The family, already desperate and without answers, began questioning everything and everyone. It was as if the skier had vanished without a trace, leaving nothing but a shadow in his wake. The emptiness left by his absence weighed heavily, and the pain of uncertainty consumed those who loved him the most. The suspense took over the situation. It wasn't just the challenging nature of the Alps at stake. It was also the deeper human emotions: loss, hopelessness, the fear of the unknown. It was clear that this case wouldn't end easily, and what seemed like a simple accident in the mountains might actually be hiding something far more complex and dark. What did the disappearance of this skier really mean? Was he truly lost? Or was there something bigger, something more complex behind it? Had nature and its relentless conditions simply consumed the skier, or was the true mystery still waiting to be uncovered? And what if, in fact, he had fallen victim to a tragedy that went beyond what the eyes could see? The search through the snow-covered mountains continued, but the answer remained just out of reach, where the most extreme conditions and the deepest secrets of nature seem to hide the truth. The disappearance of a loved one, especially when it happens under such mysterious circumstances, deeply affects the psyche of those left behind. For the skier's wife, the news that her husband was missing in the Alps was a devastating blow. Like a knife cutting through flesh, the impact of this revelation shattered her heart and soul. She knew better than anyone the adventurous nature of her husband, but this loss suddenly turned into an enigma of immense proportions. He had always been the kind of person who loved to explore his limits, challenge the forces of nature, and be in the vastness of the mountains. Yet still, the lack of clear answers about his whereabouts, about what had really happened, seemed impossible to accept. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole, and she, all alone, was trying to find a way through the pain and the search for the truth. In the first few days after his disappearance, the skier's wife tried to stay strong. She knew there was still a chance, a small possibility that he was lost, but alive, somewhere in the remote parts of the Alps. That thought became a light at the end of the tunnel, a hope for a different outcome than the tragic one. She closely followed the rescue teams, every helicopter flying over the mountains, every attempt to find him in more remote areas, as if it were the last hope to bring him back. She couldn't bring herself to believe that he was lost forever. He hadn't said goodbye, hadn't left a final message, nothing, except for a deep absence, a space that was now empty of his adventurous spirit. She couldn't even imagine the mountain taking him without him fighting until the very end. The nature he loved seemed to have become his enemy, and that made the weight of her pain even greater. As days turned into weeks, the search began to intensify. The wife wasn't willing to passively wait for answers. She was constantly on the move, going from one town to another, from one meeting with authorities to the next, never losing hope that they would find her husband. She surrounded herself with all kinds of specialists: mountain guides, experienced climbers, meteorologists, each of them a piece of the puzzle she needed to solve. But with each new day that passed without concrete news, the doubt grew stronger. At some point, she began to question whether the search was being conducted in the best possible way. Were they looking in the right places? Were the rescue teams using the most effective technologies and methods? This uncertainty created unbearable anxiety. The pain of the loss was immense, but the uncertainty of not knowing what had really happened fueled the despair even more cruelly. What could have happened that was so grave that no one could find a convincing clue? During this period of frantic searching, several theories began to surface, fueled by the lack of clear evidence. Experts initially suggested that the skier could have fallen into a ravine or been swallowed by an avalanche. However, these explanations didn't seem satisfactory. The wife wondered if her husband could have fallen so fatally in a place where his experience and knowledge of the mountains might have saved him. He knew how to protect himself in extreme situations, how to assess the terrain and the risks of a snowstorm. Or at least, she thought he did. This constant doubt, the questioning of her own perception of her husband's abilities, became an even heavier burden for her to bear. As his wife, she trusted his experience, and that made her believe that something else, something still unexplained, could have occurred. As time went on, the theories about the skier's disappearance diversified. One, more sinister, suggested that the skier might have decided in some way to end his own life. While this was an idea she didn't even want to entertain, the wife found herself compelled to consider the possibility. After all, he was at a point in his life where he was facing many personal challenges. But what seemed more unusual was the fact that the skier had never shown signs of an emotional crisis that could lead him to make such a drastic decision. It was hard for her to believe that. Could it really be possible that he felt so lost, so desperate, that he no longer wanted to live? That seemed like a complete contrast to the person she remembered. The man who loved life, nature, and his adventures. But as the void expanded and the pain of absence grew, she couldn't help but wonder, if he did do that, why? What had happened in the mountains for him to make that decision? However, more than any other theory, the wife longed above all for definitive answers. Every small piece of information, no matter how tiny, seemed like a thread to be followed. A clue, something. Interviews with other skiers and people who might have been on the same trails began to bring more fragments of a disconnected narrative. Some said they had heard rumors about the skier before his expedition, like he had been cautious about the weather, always attentive to the details. Others suggested he seemed to be in a particularly focused state of mind, as if he was about to face something big. The wife, however, couldn't make sense of these pieces. How could he, with all his experience, have gotten lost on a mountain he knew so well? How could he, with all the warning signs he knew, have put himself in such sudden danger? As time went on, she found herself more distant from her husband, but at the same time, more attached to the need for answers. The grief consuming her was fed by the uncertainty, and she knew that, to find any peace, she had to uncover the truth, no matter what it was. She couldn't keep living with the shadow of the unknown hanging over her. It wasn't just about understanding what had happened to him. It was also a search for closure. Every step towards resolving the case seemed to lead her to more questions, more theories, more uncertainties. The questions about the nature of the expedition, the weather conditions, and the circumstances of the disappearance became a whirlwind of emotions and reflections she couldn't escape. And deep down, she knew that the only way to end this anguish would be to find the truth, no matter how difficult and painful it might be. After 3 long years of fruitless searches and a constant sense of helplessness, the disappearance of the skier seemed to be turning into an unsolvable mystery. What began with the hope of a safe return turned into a story of anguish and uncertainty, with the absence of clear answers feeding the desperation of everyone involved. The mountains, once the stage for his great adventure, had now become a vast silence hiding secrets much deeper than anyone had imagined. With each passing day, the pain and frustration of the family, especially his wife, grew more intense. They had clung to the hope that somehow he might still be alive, but time seemed to be consuming that hope faster and faster. The search, which had once been intensely coordinated, had cooled. Even the investigators, exhausted and without enough clues, began to consider that the skier might be just another victim of the unforgiving alpine environment. They had already lost faith in the possibility of a positive outcome. Then, something extraordinary happened. In 2024, exactly 3 years after his disappearance, a crucial discovery was made. A GPS tracker, a device used by mountaineers and skiers to ensure their safety in remote areas, was found by a group of explorers. The tracker, which had been lost in the mountains so long ago, was located in a remote, hard-to-reach area, a place considered nearly impassable by rescue teams due to the treacherous terrain and extreme weather conditions. The revelation of this initial clue gave the case new life, rekindling hope and causing the investigation to take an entirely unexpected turn. The tracker, which seemed like just a piece of basic technology, now held great significance. It indicated that the skier had not only been alive long after his disappearance, but that his journey had been far more about survival than anyone had realized. The tracker showed that the skier was in an area that had never been considered a possibility before. Throughout the search, the rescue teams had focused on more accessible areas, concentrating on more visible and less isolated regions. But this new clue suggested he had moved to a part of the territory that, at the time, was considered inaccessible and unknown, which, to the experts, was a complete surprise. For many, the simple fact that he had survived for so long in the extreme conditions of the Alps seemed impossible. The discovery of the tracker, although significant, raised more questions than answers. What did it mean? How had the skier survived in such an isolated area for so long? Had he gotten so lost that he ended up in a region no one had thought he could have reached? Or had he gone there with a purpose, perhaps to escape from some unknown situation? The lack of clear explanations made the mystery even deeper. What initially seemed like a breakthrough to clarify the case only added to the complexity of the enigma. What began as a search for simple answers had now turned into a puzzle with multiple pieces, each leading to more questions, more theories, and consequently, more uncertainties. At first, the idea that the skier had survived longer than expected seemed like a relief to the family and the investigation. After all, the hope of finding someone alive always brings a sense of optimism. But as the details began to unfold, it soon became clear that the circumstances of his survival were far from simple. The area where the tracker was found was notoriously difficult to reach, with steep and dangerous terrain. The question that soon arose was, how could someone, especially an experienced skier, have gotten lost in such a remote and dangerous place without any of the rescue teams finding him earlier? Was the skier in a state of confusion? Or had he intentionally gone to this area, perhaps to distance himself from something or someone? There were many possibilities, and none of them seemed to offer a definitive explanation. The first attempts to reconstruct the skier's journey, based on the found tracker, revealed something even more puzzling. He seemed to have stayed in one very specific spot for a long time, suggesting there was a reason he had chosen that place, far from any usual expedition route. Some interpreted this behavior as an attempt to isolate himself, to escape from something, from an unresolved situation in his life. But behavioral experts and mountaineering specialists began to wonder if this could be a reflection of a fatal mistake, a wrong decision amid the stress and pressure of the environment. Perhaps at some point, he believed he was safer in that isolated place, where there was no one to help him, but also no one to rescue him. This theory sparked discussions among investigators, who started to question whether the skier's situation had been more of a tragedy than a conscious choice. After all, how could an experienced skier have made such a mistake? The tracker also revealed that, although the skier had been in the area for much longer than expected, he hadn't moved much during the last days recorded by the device. This raised another intriguing question. Was he truly fighting for survival, or had he somehow given up hope of being found? This stagnation in the use of the tracker suggested he was no longer moving, which could imply that he had resigned himself to a tragic fate. The tracker now seemed like another piece that raised more uncertainties than it provided solutions. For the investigators, the hardest part was realizing that, although the skier had been there for so long, he had never signaled for help, something that could have been easily done with the device itself. The mystery of the skier's death or survival seemed even more impenetrable. What made the case even more complicated was the combination of conflicting theories that emerged after the discovery of the tracker. On one hand, some believed the skier's death was the result of a tragic accident, a fatality caused by human error or severe weather conditions. Others, however, were increasingly convinced that there was something more to this disappearance, something more sinister and intentional. The fact that the tracker had been found in such an isolated area, without clear signs that the skier had made any attempt to communicate with his rescue teams, led investigators to consider the possibility that he might have been the victim of sabotage or a critical miscalculation, something that could have caused the tragedy in an irreversible way. The idea that the skier had been alive for so long but had never asked for help made all possibilities worth reconsidering. The truth seemed further away than ever, and the tension between the divergent theories only grew as new details emerged. Finally, as more investigations were carried out in the remote area where the tracker was found, another line of reasoning was suggested. Perhaps the skier had been trying to reach a strategic location, perhaps a region with some important geographical or geological feature, something that hadn't been immediately obvious to the authorities, but that the skier had identified during his previous expeditions. Experts began to study the mountains from a different perspective, as if they were trying to interpret a complex code hidden in nature, and with each new analysis, more questions arose, deepening the mystery even further. The discovery of the GPS tracker was a skier's disappearance, but at the same time, it highlighted the complexity of the situation. The tracker wasn't just a simple clue, but a milestone that forced everyone to reevaluate everything known about the case. What initially seemed like a simple accident or a natural tragedy began to evolve into an intricate web of possible explanations, theories, and new areas to explore. What was once just a search for a missing skier in the mountains had become a multifaceted investigation, involving a range of experts and analyses that would ultimately reveal much more than anyone had imagined about the disappearance. In the days following the discovery of the tracker, the investigative team quickly began to gather specialists from various fields: experienced mountaineers, meteorologists, geographers, and rescue equipment experts. They knew that every detail could be the key to understanding what really happened. The tracker had been found in a remote area of the Alps, and now they needed to figure out how the skier had ended up there and, more importantly, what he was doing in such an isolated area. The first step was to map the tracker's location, analyzing not only the skier's trajectory, but also the terrain and weather conditions at the time of the disappearance. With the help of experienced mountaineers, it was found. The region was known to be extremely treacherous, with steep, difficult-to-reach terrain and frequent sudden snowstorms. The skier, with his experience, likely knew the dangers of the area, but what the specialists couldn't understand was why he had moved to such a distant location, far from the usual ski routes. The first analyses indicated that the skier had followed a route that, although challenging, was not impossible. However, the fact that he had been able to get so far in such dangerous terrain without being found by rescue teams all this time indicated that something was much deeper than a simple human error. Meteorologists began reviewing the weather data from the time the skier disappeared. What they discovered was even more disturbing. The weather conditions in the area had been extremely volatile, with sudden snowstorms and strong winds that made both visibility and navigation difficult. But what stood out the most was that, during the time of the disappearance, there had been a window of time when the weather had apparently calmed, which might have allowed the skier to move without being detected. If he had done that, what would have driven him to seek such an isolated location? Could it be that he had gotten lost? Or, on the contrary, had he intentionally sought out this place? The idea that he might have been fully aware of his movements on the mountain sparked intense discussions among the experts. As the investigation progressed, new discoveries started to emerge. Reports from other skiers and climbers who had passed through the same region in the years following the skier's disappearance were analyzed more deeply. Some reported having found signs of someone who had unsuccessfully tried to make a rescue. Others mentioned finding abandoned equipment in strategic locations, as if someone had been trying to leave clues but failed. Each of these discoveries seemed to fit into a narrative of struggle for survival, but also of a tragic fate that seemed increasingly inevitable. But the most curious of all was a seemingly insignificant report at first, which caught the attention of a more observant investigator. A climber who had scaled the same area years after the disappearance claimed to have seen ski tracks left at the top of a hill, apparently made by a skier who was attempting to cross the region in search of a rescue point. The detail that stood out was the angle of these tracks. They indicated that the skier was likely trying to cross an area known to be extremely dangerous and prone to avalanches. What was most striking was that, despite the risks, the tracks seemed to show a desperate attempt to move forward, perhaps in search of some form of shelter or safety. If the skier had indeed been there, what would have driven him to take such a risk? There was something more to this story than anyone had realized, and the investigators were starting to realize they needed to adjust their line of inquiry. At the same time, another line of investigation was opened. Rescue and survival experts began studying the possible strategies the skier could have used to survive for so long in the mountains. The skier, an experienced man, likely knew what to do to protect himself from the harsh conditions. However, what became clear was that he wasn't just trying to survive in the most basic way possible. He had made strategic choices, as if he understood that his only chance of survival depended on finding a specific location or a rescue point. The experts began asking themselves, could it be that the skier had found something in the mountains, perhaps a point of interest, a discovery, or even a source of information that motivated him to keep moving into such an isolated and dangerous area? This could explain his insistence on trying to cross such treacherous terrain, as if something larger was at play than just his survival. In parallel, other members of the investigation began to delve deeper into the skier's psychological conditions. What would drive someone to cross such a remote and dangerous territory? Undoubtedly, survival was a factor, but there was also the question of the mental states that could have influenced his decisions. How was the skier dealing with the loneliness and desperation while fighting to survive in such a hostile environment? Psychologists involved in the investigation theorized that he might have entered a state of extreme survival, where his decisions were driven not only by the need to protect himself, but also by the urgency to understand what had happened or to do something that would change the course of his story. This raised a series of questions about the nature of expeditions in such remote and inhospitable places. In extreme situations, can the human mind be an ally or an enemy? And, more importantly, what had the skier done to survive for so long under such conditions? As the discoveries accumulated, more theories emerged, but none seemed sufficient to resolve the mystery once and for all. The skier, with his experience and skill, had made choices that couldn't be fully explained. Every clue that emerged opened doors to contradictory theories. On one hand, the idea that he had gotten lost seemed more plausible given the vast terrain and unpredictable conditions. On the other hand, his insistence on going to such a remote location, where the chances of being found were almost nil, suggested that he might have been fleeing from something or searching for a truth that hadn't been revealed yet. But what was that truth? And more importantly, why had he made these choices? These questions remained unanswered, making the investigation even more challenging. The case of the missing skier in the Alps had turned into a great enigma where every new discovery seemed to deepen the mystery. The search for answers was no longer just about finding a lost man, but about understanding what really happened in an expedition that had gone wrong in unimaginable ways. As investigators scoured the mountains and examined every clue with greater care, the feeling that something much bigger was at play, something still undiscovered, continued to grow. And so, the story of the missing skier became ever more complex, challenging everyone involved to rethink what they knew about survival, human nature, and the extreme choices made in unforeseen circumstances. As the investigation into the disappearance of the skier progressed, the case began to take on more complex and darker contours. The discovery of the GPS tracker had given new life to the search, but the growing web of theories and assumptions seemed to leave everyone more perplexed with each new step. In this scenario, key figures emerged who would play essential roles in the search for the truth. Among them, two characters stood out, not only for their skills, but also for the way they approached the unfolding mystery. The first character was an experienced investigator named Ricardo, who, when called in to handle the case, brought not only years of experience in missing person cases, but also a dose of skepticism necessary to analyze the case with a critical eye. Ricardo knew that, as powerful as modern technology and available resources were, the truth about what really happened in situations like this often hid in the details, in the small things others might overlook. His focus wasn't on the more obvious evidence, but on the points that, until that moment, seemed irrelevant. As he often said, in investigation, the key is often in what no one wants to see, because everyone is looking for the wrong answer. Alongside Ricardo, another key figure emerged. Enrique, a veteran mountaineer, specialized in rescues in extreme mountain conditions. Enrique was known for his pragmatism and vast experience in adverse situations, making him a key player in the investigation. He knew better than anyone how treacherous the mountain elements could be, and he also knew that, even in the worst conditions, people could survive much longer than they realized, if only they knew how to act and understand the signs of nature. Enrique wasn't shaken by the idea that the skier might have gotten lost. On the contrary, he believed that the skier could have had a reason for moving to such an isolated area. However, with each new clue, Enrique became more convinced that something else was at play here, something that couldn't be explained by the mountain's conditions alone. It was with the help of these two characters that the investigation took on a new direction. Both agreed that the skier's behavior before his expedition was a crucial point to be examined in more depth. It was at this point that the first interviews with people close to the skier revealed information that, while initially seeming trivial, began to cast new light on the case. One of the most revealing interviews was with a close friend of the skier, who described a change in his behavior in the weeks leading up to the expedition. According to the friend, the skier had been acting differently, more introspective, and even a bit distant from his friends and family. There was a restlessness in his gaze, a tension that wasn't typically his trademark. In casual conversations, he briefly mentioned the expedition, but he didn't seem as excited as he usually was before other trips. This started raising a series of questions. Was the skier going through some personal issue? Was there something else, perhaps a hidden motivation to go to such a remote and dangerous place? These doubts began making the investigators question the reasons behind the skier's trip, and if there was more to the story than just a passion for mountaineering. Later, in another interview with a professional colleague of the skier, a new clue was revealed. The colleague shared that, a few days before the trip, the skier had mentioned a specific area in the Alps, a remote place he had always wanted to explore. This colleague, who had already done a few expeditions in the same mountains, was surprised by the skier's choice, as that location was notoriously dangerous and hard to access. He asked his friend if he was sure about wanting to risk going there, and the skier responded evasively, almost as if trying to avoid the subject. This small detail was enough for Enrique and Ricardo to start formulating new theories. It seemed that, for some reason, the skier was willing to go beyond what his experience and skill would normally allow. What had motivated him to stray so far from the conventional routes? With these new clues, the investigation took a new turn. Enrique, with his vast experience, began reviewing the skier's behavior and the critical points of the expedition, and his intuition led him to an unsettling possibility. What if the skier had been more intentional in his route choices? What if he had moved to that remote point in the Alps because there was something more to discover, something he believed he could find in the depths of the mountain? This theory raised even deeper questions about the skier's behavior. He could have gotten lost, yes, but he could also have been in search of something much greater than just a personal achievement. As the experts began to investigate the GPS tracker more thoroughly, which indicated where the skier had been, discrepancies started to emerge. The fact that he had moved into such remote and hard-to-reach areas suggested that he wasn't just trying to escape a dangerous zone, but might have consciously chosen to move forward. This became even more intriguing considering the skier had left minimal traces, which suggested he wasn't in panic or trying to be found, but rather moving with some kind of clear, calculated intention. This raised suspicions that something much more complex was at play, something no one had predicted. As the investigation progressed, new characters began to appear. Among them was a member of a previous expedition, who came forward as a key witness. This climber, although not directly involved in the case, had known the skier for a long time and shared a curious experience. He reported that, during one of his past expeditions, the skier had briefly discussed a discovery he had made on one of the mountains, something he considered important but didn't want to disclose at the time. This revelation became one of the main discussion points among the investigators. Could it be that the skier had made a significant discovery in the mountains, something that had led him to return, even if it meant risking his life? Or was he, in fact, simply obsessed with something so personal and mysterious that he was willing to follow any clue without considering the dangers of the journey? Questions began to pile up, and suspicions grew. Each interview, each new testimony, only increased the uncertainty about what had really happened. Investigators began to realize that the skier, though cautious and skilled, might have gotten involved in a situation beyond his control. Was he searching for something? Or was he simply trying to escape? Theories about the reason for his expedition took various directions, and with that, the mystery of his disappearance became even deeper. As new key characters emerged and more interviews were conducted, a central question emerged. Had the skier really gotten lost, or did his journey to that remote part of the Alps have a darker purpose? With each new clue, more questions arose, and more people began to doubt the official version of events. The investigation was far from reaching a conclusion, but now the investigators were convinced that the truth was hidden somewhere in the mountains, waiting to be discovered. As the investigation into the disappearance of the skier unfolded, new details began to emerge, giving investigators an even more intricate perspective on the skier's disappearance. What had seemed like a simple accident in the Alps was now turning into a much bigger mystery, a web of events and decisions intertwining in complex ways. As the revelations began to surface, those involved in the case realized that the disappearance of the skier wasn't a matter of bad luck or a natural tragedy, but rather an enigma with many layers still to be unraveled. One of the first significant revelations came from a close friend of the skier who, during one of the interviews with the investigative team, shared something that hadn't been mentioned before. He always talked about something in the mountains but never gave details. Something he wanted to find. It didn't seem to be just about skiing or overcoming extreme conditions. There was another motivation. These words shed new light on the situation. Throughout his life, the skier had always been known for his passion for mountain challenges, but this other motivation mentioned by the friend opened a door that investigators hadn't considered before. Was the skier searching for something specific? Was he after a discovery, something deep in the mountains, perhaps even a revelation he considered important but hadn't shared with anyone? Ricardo, the lead investigator, became obsessed with this clue. He knew that the reason for the skier's disappearance could be something beyond a simple skiing accident. The idea that the skier could have ventured into a remote area of the mountains for a personal or intellectual reason made the investigation take a new direction. The skier wasn't just trying to survive. He was searching for something, and perhaps he had found something that made him press on, even when the situation became more dangerous. This theory gained traction when the investigative team began reviewing the records of the skier's previous expeditions. A mountaineer who had worked with him on an expedition a few months before the disappearance reported something peculiar. During that expedition, the skier spent more time than usual examining a rare geological formation in the mountains. According to the mountaineer, the skier seemed particularly interested in this formation, almost as if he were trying to discover something. He asked several times about the terrain and location, always vaguely, but with a fixed gaze, as if searching for something. This behavior, though peculiar, wasn't taken seriously at the time. However, now with the GPS tracker and the new information, this obsession with a specific geological formation in the mountains became a key point in the investigation. By delving into the archives of maps and geological records of the area, the investigative team discovered something that left everyone stunned. There was a rare formation in the Alps, little known and still not fully explored, located in the same place where the tracker had been found. The discovery that the skier might have been drawn to this mysterious formation made the investigators wonder if he was searching for something more, perhaps something no one else knew, but that he believed was vital or revealing. The connection between the skier's peculiar behavior and the geological discovery now seemed clear. He was searching for something, and that search had likely led him to that remote and dangerous area. But what exactly had he found or expected to find? That was the question no one could answer, but it now seemed to be the key to understanding the disappearance. Tensions within the investigative team began to grow as new clues emerged. Ricardo, the lead investigator, felt increasingly convinced that the skier's death was far from a trivial accident. He began to question everything that had been said previously, including the assumptions that he had gotten lost or had died in a natural accident. At the same time, Enrique, the veteran mountaineer, began to ask deeper questions about the skier's motivations. For Enrique, there was something darker in the story, something not just related to the nature of the mountains, but also to the skier's deep drive, something related to his mental and psychological state. Enrique believed that at some point, the skier might have made decisions that weren't just about survival, but about an obsessive desire to understand something beyond what people normally sought in the mountains. This thought began to spark internal conflict within the investigative team. Was the skier really a victim of his own obsession with answers, or was he being manipulated by something bigger, something he didn't fully understand? The situation became even more tense when investigators began considering a disturbing theory. What if the skier had found something in the mountains that, in some way, had put him in danger? Or what if he had been the target of something more sinister, like sabotage? The idea that the skier might have been manipulated or led to make fatal decisions fit with many of the clues that had emerged. A series of contradictory pieces of information came up during the interviews, some of which indicated that the skier hadn't been alone on the mountain, but that someone else had been there before or during his expedition. These clues weren't clear, but they began to create a sense of mistrust among the investigators. They needed to figure out if there was another person involved, someone who had influenced the skier in some way. In a tense moment of the investigation, the skier's wife, still devastated by the loss, was called in for a new interview. She had remained silent for weeks, but now seemed willing to talk more about her husband. During the conversation, she revealed something no one had imagined. She said that in some of the last conversations she had with the skier before the expedition, he mentioned being worried about an important discovery in the mountains. He didn't explain what it was, but his concern was evident. This was a shock to everyone involved, as until then, the idea that the skier was searching for something big in the mountains hadn't been considered a plausible possibility. But now, with this new information, the investigation was entering dangerous territory, where there was no longer certainty about the skier's motivations, and the possibility that he had somehow been at risk of being manipulated or influenced by external forces became more real than ever. The shock of this revelation rattled everyone involved. Ricardo and Henrique began to ask themselves, had the skier gotten lost, or was he being guided by something bigger, something he couldn't control? And if there were an external force influencing his decisions, who or what was behind it? Every new fact seemed to open doors to more questions, and as the investigators followed these leads, the path to the truth grew more obscure. The confrontation between the conflicting theories about what really happened to the skier intensified. Was he really in search of a hidden truth in the mountains? Or did his search lead him to make wrong decisions, putting his life at risk? And more importantly, what had he really found? The investigation was increasingly becoming a battle not just for answers, but for understanding the very limits of human reason in the face of the unknown. The case of the missing skier, which had started as a simple search for answers, had turned into a story full of twists and unexpected complexities. What had once seemed like just a tragic accident in the Alps was now revealing itself to be a deeper mystery, full of doubts and unresolved mysteries. Each new clue, each interview, and each revelation about the skier's true intentions raised more questions, more theories, but also a growing sense that the truth was within reach, waiting to be discovered. Finally, after 3 years of intense investigation and unexpected twists, the moment of truth seemed to be approaching. A new expedition was organized with the expectation that it would bring the final answer about what had really happened to the skier. The expedition would be larger, more focused, and above all, more careful. The GPS tracker, found in a remote area of the mountains, indicated a specific location where, according to records, the skier had been during the last days of his journey. The discovery of this tracker, which had been overlooked in the initial searches, gave the investigation a new perspective. The tracker pointed to an area that was hard to access, and now the investigators were determined to explore this area with a level of depth and organization that had never been done before. Ricardo, the lead investigator, knew that this expedition would be the key to uncovering what had really happened. He had prepared himself to face the challenges that would arise, but he also felt the pressure that time was against him. The more time passed, the more the skier's story became a symbol of an unsolved mystery, and the risk of never finding the truth became an increasingly real possibility. However, he was determined. He felt that finally he had the right clues and the right team to solve the case.
For him, this expedition would not just be about finding the skier's body, but about finding the answer to the big question: what really happened to him? Henrique, the veteran mountaineer and rescue expert, was also part of the expedition, bringing his vast experience. He knew the task they were about to face wouldn't be easy. The Alps, especially the remote areas they needed to explore, were treacherous and unpredictable.
Sudden snowstorms, strong winds, and unstable terrain could turn the expedition into a nightmare. But Henrique wasn't someone easily intimidated. He knew the only way to get to the truth was to face the challenges head-on. And his intuition told him the answer was indeed in that isolated region that few dared to explore. The expedition began with palpable tension. The rescue team, composed of mountaineering and survival experts, was aware of the risks they were taking. They weren't just dealing with nature, but with the fact that the skier had ventured alone into an extremely dangerous area, which could mean he was in a desperate situation, or if still alive, running a great risk of not surviving any longer. The new expedition not only placed them in physical danger, but also in mental danger. Everyone was aware that, if they found anything, it would be both an exciting and terrifying discovery. No matter how prepared they were for this journey, no one knew what truly awaited them. As the team made their way through the mountains, they encountered increasingly difficult obstacles. The snow was deep and unstable, the winds cut with ferocity, and the trails became harder and harder to follow. But Ricardo and Henrique's determination kept them focused. When they finally reached the area indicated by the tracker, the tension within the team was palpable. What would they find there? Were they finally close to a discovery, or was what awaited them just another clue that would lead to another unknown? No one knew, but everyone was aware that they were about to face a decisive moment. Then something happened that completely changed the course of the expedition. At a critical point in the journey, as the team was exploring a particularly treacherous area, Henrique, with his experience, noticed something unusual. A small detail, almost imperceptible, but it caught his attention. Among the rocks and the compacted snow, he found a mark, a ski mark, followed by a series of footprints, as if someone had dragged themselves through the area toward a specific point. Henrique immediately shared his discovery with Ricardo, who was shocked by the possibility that the skier could have left these tracks recently, which meant he could still be alive, or that the situation had unfolded very differently than anyone had imagined. The ski tracks seemed to have been made recently, and by following these footprints, the team reached a natural cave that was partially covered with snow. Upon carefully entering the cave, they made a discovery that immediately changed the course of the investigation. Inside the cave, there was equipment left behind, including a backpack, some ski items, and a small improvised shelter. But what truly surprised everyone was what was found alongside the equipment: a pile of documents, maps, and notes written by the skier himself. They were covered in snow and a bit damaged, but still legible enough for the team to begin analyzing. There was a sort of journal, written with urgency, where the skier detailed his journey and, more importantly, his discoveries. He mentioned the geological formation he had found earlier and how it had fascinated him. He believed there was something extraordinary in the rocks and the structure of the mountains, something no one else had noticed. The skier had also recorded his doubts about the safety of the area and about the behavior of the people he had encountered during previous expeditions. But what really stood out in the records was the skier's conclusion. He believed he had made an important discovery, one that could change the way people viewed the Alps mountains, and somehow he was determined to finish what he had started, no matter the cost. The expedition members were stunned as they read these words. Everything they knew about the skier's case was being challenged by this simple discovery. The skier had not been a victim of a random accident. He had ventured out to make a scientific or personal discovery of great importance, something he believed was far greater than just a ski expedition. This raised a new set of questions. What exactly had he found? And who else knew about his discovery? Had the skier been on a solitary journey to reveal something significant? And perhaps this quest had led him to a tragic fate. With the discovery of the journal and the documents, the expedition reached its climax. The investigative team now understood that the disappearance of the skier was not the end, but the beginning of a bigger story. A story of mystery, obsession, and perhaps even danger. The skier, in his search for the unknown, had left behind more than just clues. He had left a story of courage, dedication, and the pursuit of truth. The emotional impact of this discovery shook everyone present, because in some way, the skier was more present than ever, and the truth about what happened to him was within reach. But the big question remained. Had he found what he was looking for? And if so, what was the price of that discovery? The truth finally began to emerge, but it brought with it a weight that no one could have predicted. After months of investigation and unexpected twists, the discovery of the diary and documents left behind by the skier revealed more than just the details of his journey in the mountains. The skier hadn't been in search of a simple adventure or another challenge in the mountains. He had embarked on a larger mission, involving a scientific and geological discovery that, according to his notes, could change the way the world viewed the Alps mountains. What had once seemed like a search for answers about his disappearance now transformed into a story of obsession, of a man who risked everything to unravel a mystery greater than himself. Based on the information found in the diary, the investigation team was able to map out what the skier had done in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. The skier hadn't disappeared due to a trivial accident, but because he had ventured into unknown territory, in search of something he believed to be of immense importance. The geological discovery he repeatedly mentioned seemed to be the focal point of his mission. He believed that deep within the mountains he had found a rare formation, something that could change the paradigms of science. His obsession with this discovery led him to stray from the more well-known routes, to venture into an isolated and hard-to-reach area where he inevitably got lost. This revelation brought a mixture of relief and deep sadness to the family, especially to the skier's wife. She had always known that her husband had a deep passion for challenges, but she never imagined that this passion would lead to such a tragic end. While she was finally understanding the motivations behind his journey, the pain of the loss didn't disappear. She found herself in a complex position as, at the same time that she understood her husband's determination, she was also devastated by losing someone so important to her, all because of an obsession he hadn't fully shared with anyone. However, the discoveries weren't enough to provide complete closure. The investigation into the skier didn't end with the diary. There were still many unanswered questions, especially about what he had truly found in the mountains. Although he had documented his geological discoveries and had made it clear that something significant was there, the documents didn't provide a clear answer about what he believed he had found. For the investigators, this remained an unsolved riddle. They now had enough evidence to know that the skier hadn't simply gotten lost, but had been involved in a personal mission he believed to be of enormous importance. Yet the question of what he had truly discovered still hung in the air, without a satisfactory explanation. Justice, in some sense, was served in a technical way. However, the moral implications of the situation left those involved with a feeling that the truth, though revealed, couldn't bring a true sense of justice. The wife, upon discovering the magnitude of her husband's quest, didn't know whether she should feel relieved to finally understand his motivations or fall even deeper into grief, since the tragedy could have been avoided if he had shared more of his obsession with those around him. The skier had risked everything for something he believed was bigger than himself, but the question that no one could answer was it really necessary? Was he willing to pay the ultimate price for a discovery that no one else could understand? Furthermore, the discovery that the skier had been drawn to something bigger than a simple personal expedition also raised another disturbing question. Upon reviewing the notes and interviews, it became clear that he wasn't entirely alone in his search. There were, in fact, mentions of a group of interest that he had encountered during his previous expeditions. Though his notes were vague and evasive, the skier seemed aware that there were people watching his discoveries. This, to the investigators, raised an even more complex hypothesis. Could the skier have been manipulated by external forces? Or perhaps he had gotten involved in something he didn't fully understand. The idea that he had been manipulated or lured to the mountain by unknown interests left the investigators with a bitter taste, as though there was more to the story than they could perceive. This doubt about the external motivations that might have influenced the skier became a point of confrontation for the investigators. Ricardo, the lead investigator, found himself divided. He believed that the skier's death was the result of his obsession and his own choices, but he also couldn't help but question if there was more behind it. The skier hadn't just gotten lost in the mountains. He had been drawn to an unknown territory by a mystery that seemed to involve more people. This inevitably generated the sense that there was an external factor that, somehow, influenced the skier's journey, leading him to make decisions he might not have made otherwise. As the investigation neared its end, those involved began to reflect on the impact of the skier's death. The sense of justice seemed evasive. He had done his part, sought the truth, but the price of that truth-seeking had been extremely high. The investigative team felt that true justice couldn't be achieved just by finding answers, but also by gaining a deeper understanding of the choices people make in pursuit of their goals. For the family, especially the wife, the answer to what happened didn't provide complete comfort. She now knew what had motivated her husband, but that didn't diminish the pain of his absence. The tragedy was still there, palpable, and justice seemed like nothing more than a distant abstraction. Justice had been done in terms of understanding, but the true sense of resolution and peace was never reached. The skier, in his quest for the unknown, had challenged not only the limits of nature but also the limits of what was possible for him. And in the end, that search led him to a tragic and irreversible fate, which everyone would understand, but no one could change. The Alps mountains, with their beauty and dangers, became a silent witness to what he had risked, and to what the truth, no matter how clear, couldn't erase. The outcome of the search for the skier, finally revealed, brought with it an ambiguous feeling of relief and sadness, a closure that didn't seem complete. For his wife, the truth about what had happened to her husband, though enlightening, did not bring her the peace she had imagined. She had known he had an unusual passion for the mountains and immense challenges, but now she understood how this obsession with an unknown discovery had led him to a tragic end. During all those months of searching and uncertainty, she had been lost in a whirlwind of emotions, trying to understand what had happened, but she never knew if her grief was for the loss of him. Upon discovering the skier's true motivations, she finally understood what had driven him to take such risks. He wasn't in search of simple glory or adventure. He was searching for something greater than his own life. He believed his discoveries in the mountains could change people's understanding of the natural world, a mission that seemed to occupy his entire mind. But the price he paid for this obsession was immense. The skier was so focused on his mission that he didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to acknowledge, the risks he was taking. What had seemed like a simple expedition turned into a fatal isolation, and this tragedy had now become part of his legacy. For his wife, this revelation brought a mix of feelings. On one hand, she was relieved to finally understand the reasons that had led him to disappear. But on the other, this understanding only amplified the pain of her loss. She knew he had an obsession with discovery, but this had never been completely clear to her. Now, with the words written in his journal, she could see more clearly the depth of her husband's quest. However, this vision came with the loss of a person who had been in search of something far beyond himself. He never had the chance to share everything he had discovered, and this thought seemed to weigh on her more than anything else. The pain of loss mixed with a sense of regret. He really believed he was onto something huge, but he went so far, he never came back. For the investigators, especially Ricardo and Henrique, The conclusion brought a sense of relief, yet at the same time, frustration. They had devoted so much time and energy to understanding what really happened to the skier, and finally, upon discovering the contents of the journal and the notes, they understood that the man had been searching for a scientific revelation of great importance. But this revelation didn't lessen the pain of the loss. There was something incredibly sad about knowing that the skier had given his life for something that, in the end, would never be publicly recognized. Even if the skier had found something important, he had died in a remote, isolated location, without leaving a clear clue of his discovery for the world. His records, though vital to the investigation, were not enough to provide a full answer to what he had really discovered. The mystery surrounding his geological discovery remained, as his death had prevented him from sharing the great revelation he believed he had made. The investigators found themselves reflecting on what the relentless search for truth really meant. They had solved the mystery, yes, but the answer didn't come with a sense of completeness or justice. The skier, in his search for answers beyond the borders of what was known, had not considered the personal cost of his journey. Although his dedication and obsession had revealed something valuable, this discovery would not bring him the peace he sought, nor peace for those left behind. The question everyone asked was, could the skier's death be justified by something he believed was more important than his own life? Or was he, in the end, a victim of his own obsession? Yet despite the sadness that permeated the situation, there was also a deep respect for the skier's courage and determination. He had challenged nature, and perhaps even his own limits, to find something he considered the key to a greater understanding of the world. His journey, though tragic, served as a reminder that sometimes the pursuit of a higher purpose or truth can lead us down dangerous and unpredictable paths. This reflection on the limits of obsession and the search for knowledge, which often blinds us to the consequences of our actions, was one of the main legacies left by the skier. And for his wife, the outcome didn't mean she had found the emotional closure she so desperately sought. The void left by her husband was deep, and the explanation of his actions didn't bring the healing for the grief she carried. However, she knew that, at least now, she understood the reasons behind his death. This understanding, as painful as it was, provided some emotional relief. She could, in some way, move forward with the sense that, to some extent, she had been part of something greater that he had tried to achieve, even if he had paid the ultimate price for it. She could finally find a way to honor his memory, not just as the man who left, but as the explorer and thinker who risked everything for a greater truth. The case of the missing skier became a point of reflection for everyone involved. The pursuit of truth, as legitimate as it was, carried with it the weight of human choices, consequences, and obsessions. While the truth about what happened to the skier became clear, the feeling of justice could never be complete.